Hello, my name is Bonvecchio, and my presentation is going to be on Ivan Pavlov and his behaviorist learning theory. A little background on Ivan Pavlov. Here he is. He was born in 1849 and he passed away in 1936. He was born in a small village in central Russia. His parents and his family hoped that he would become a priest, and they sent him to a theological seminary. During the seminary, he at some point read something on Charles Darwin, and he found that he loved science, so he decided he was going to follow his scientific pursuits, and he left the seminary to go to the University of St. Petersburg. At the University of St. Petersburg, he studied chemistry and physiology, and he got his doctorates in 1879. He continued his studies, and he decided he was going to concentrate on digestion and blood circulation, and his work was very well known, and he became eventually a professor of physiology at the Imperial Medical Academy. The behaviorist approach, a little background on that. It was the primary paradigm, so it was a primary type of psychology taking place in the 1920s to 1950s. And it was based on a number of underlying assumptions regarding methodology and behavioral analysis. What do behaviorists believe? They believe that psychology should be seen as a science. Theories need to be supported by empirical data obtained through careful and controlled observation and measurement of behavior. Behaviorism is primarily concerned with observable behavior as opposed to internal events like thinking and feeling. So they believe that behavior that was external, that you could see, was objectively and scientifically measured. They also believe that people don't have free will, that we are all a result of our environment. Everything that we do, all of our behavior is a result of the environment and what we have learned. So they believe that we are born as a tabula rasa, which means a blank slate, and therefore all our behavior is learned from environment. There's little difference between the learning that takes place in humans and the learning that takes place in other animals. Therefore, research can be carried out on animals and then be carried out on humans as well, which we're going to see in a little bit with Pavlov and his dogs. Behavior is a result of stimulus, response. All behavior, no matter how complex, can be reduced to a simple stimulus response association, is what they call it. So Pavlov, the beginning of behaviorism, he was one of the first, he was a scientist, not a psychologist. He was one of the first scientists that delved into behaviorism and its theory. Pavlov published the results of an experiment on conditioning after originally studying digestion in dogs. So that's what he was originally studying, digestion in dogs. That was one of his main things that he liked to study. And like many great scientific advances, the theory that he comes up with was accidental. It was discovered accidentally. Ivan Pavlov was looking at the salivation in dogs in response to being fed. When he noticed that his dogs would begin to salivate whenever he entered the room, even when he didn't have food, he knew that he had discovered something big. So this is an example. Pavlov started from the idea that there are some things that a dog does not need to learn. For example, dogs don't learn to salivate whenever they see food. This reflex is hardwired into the dog. In behaviorist terms, it is an unconditioned response. That's what they call that, unconditioned response. Pavlov showed the existence of the unconditioned response by presenting a dog with a bowl of food and measuring its salivary secretions. And here we have a little graphic of what he did. So the dogs were presented with the bowl of food, and their saliva was collected in a drum. And then he further discovered that any object or event which the dogs learned to associate with food, including his lab assistant, they would trigger the same response. He then started to experiment with this situation. Pavlov knew that somehow the dogs in his lab had learned to associate food with his lab assistant as well, not only him, and that this must have been learned at some point because at one point they did not associate the lab assistants with that response. So in his experiment, Pavlov used a bell as his neutral stimulus, and whenever he gave food to his dogs, he rang the bell. After a number of repeats of this procedure, he tried the bell on its own, and it produced increased salivation in the dogs. So here's a graphic where it shows what I just spoke about. Before conditioning, so this is the unconditioned stimulus, the food, and the unconditioned response is the salivation. So this is the hardwired part, what the dog is hardwired to do. And again, this is before conditioning. He rings the tuning fork or the bell. He actually used several different stimuluses just to prove his point further. So he rings the tuning fork or the bell, whatever it is he was using at the moment, and nothing happened. So there was no salivation from the dogs. And then during conditioning, what he would do is he would ring the tuning fork, the bell, whatever he was using again, and then give the dog food, which produced the unconditioned response of salivation due to the food. Eventually, after conditioning, Pavlov only had to ring the bell or the tuning fork, and it produced the conditioned response. So now the dog was conditioned to respond to the bell or the tuning fork with salivation. And here's a little look at the experiment that Pavlov did.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
So as they just mentioned in the video, the few other things that came from Pavlov's study is that the theory of extinction, which occurs when the conditioned stimulus is presented a number of times without the unconditioned stimulus. So the result is, for example, as they just said with the dogs, that the bell is rung, so the dogs salivate when the stimulus has been conditioned. If you keep ringing the bell, but then you don't give the original stimulus to the dog, which is the food, then eventually the dog will disassociate or unlearn the fact that the bell means food, and they will no longer salivate. This is used by psychologists to help people overcome their fears, and one way is with desensitization. If you have a fear of heights, they constantly expose you to heights, and therefore you will unlearn the fear of heights. And the second thing is stimulus generalization. It occurs when a stimulus is similar to the conditioned stimulus. So if there is a bell that sounds very similar to what the bell that Pavlov was using at any other point, the dogs will start to salivate because they are generalizing that sound for that conditioned response. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. This is a little cartoon